Some men find out their wife is cheating and fall apart. They cry, they beg, they drunk dial their buddies at 2 a.m. and say things like, "I just don't understand how she could do this to me. I am not that man." Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your favorite snack, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Peter Vance, and the night my wife tried to hand my life to someone else, like a bag of leftover takeout, I smiled, poured more wine, and said 2 words in perfect German that made a very powerful man's blood run cold. But before we get to that moment, let me take you back. Because if you don't understand where I came from, you won't understand why what happened next was never an accident. It started on a Tuesday, which if you think about it, is the most insulting day of the week to have your life unravel. Not a dramatic Friday, not even a moody Sunday, a Tuesday. I'd had a longer day than usual, back-to-back client calls, a lukewarm cup of coffee that had been sitting on my desk so long, it had basically given up on life. And my wife Rachel, leaning against the kitchen counter with that particular smile she wore when she wanted something. Rachel was beautiful, the way certain storms are beautiful, the kind you stand at the window admiring right up until the moment the roof caves in. "Peter," she said in that warm, honey-dipped voice, "Klaus wants to take us to dinner on Friday. He says he wants to get to know the man behind the woman, Klaus, her boss. Klaus Brenner, Senior Managing Director of Brenner Weiss Capital, the kind of man whose suits cost more than most people's cars. I'd heard the name for 2 years, heard it in passing, heard it when Rachel came home flushed from late client meetings, heard it in the particular ways she never quite met my eyes when she said it. I looked up from my laptop. "Sure," I said. "Sounds great." And I smiled. Rachel blinked. I think she was expecting resistance, a raised eyebrow, maybe a territorial grunt, something. But I just smiled and went back to my screen. What Rachel did not know, what she could not know, was that I had been waiting for this dinner for a very, very long time. Now here's what you need to understand about me. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your name, nobody knows your father's, and the library is the most interesting building in a 3-mile radius. My mother, Carol Vance, raised me alone. No explanation, no apologies. She worked nights at a nursing facility, days at a diner, and somehow still found the energy to quiz me on vocabulary words before bed. She never talked about my father, not once, until the night she was dying. I was 31 years old, sitting beside her hospital bed, holding a hand that had gotten so thin I was almost afraid to squeeze it. The machines beeped their steady and different rhythm, and my mother turned to look at me with eyes that were more alert than they had any right to be. "Peter," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "There are things I should have told you. Mom, you don't have to hush." She never lost that. Even dying, she could still hush me with surgical precision. "Your father's name is Gerald Brenner." I went very still. He was a visiting lecturer at the university. We were young. He was persuasive. She closed her eyes briefly. "When I told him I was pregnant, he gave me money and a one-way bus ticket back to Ohio. He told me if I ever contacted him again, he would make sure I regretted it." She turned to look at me. "He has a son, Peter, legitimate, named Klaus. He runs the family business now. Gerald is old, sick, and I hear he's recently rewritten his will." The machines kept beeping. "I'm telling you this," she said slowly, "not so you can go looking for trouble, but so that if trouble ever comes looking for you, you'll know what you're holding." She died 4 days later. I spent the next 6 months doing what I do best, research. I am, professionally speaking, a forensic financial analyst, which is a fancy way of saying companies pay me to find the money other people think they've hidden. I am very good at following threads, and Gerald Brenner had left a lot of threads. Here's the short version. Gerald Brenner was dying. Prostate cancer stage 4. His legitimate heir, Klaus, stood to inherit a controlling interest in Brenner Weiss Capital, worth conservatively $600 million. But Gerald, in a moment that I can only describe as either guilt or spite, had recently begun the process of amending his estate documents to include a second heir, a son he'd never acknowledged. Gerald had hired a private investigator to find my mother, only to discover she died 3 weeks before, but her son, me, was very much alive, which meant I was about to become the most inconvenient person in Klaus Brenner's world. The question was, did Klaus know? And then 4 months into my quiet investigation, Rachel came home and told me she had a new boss. His name was Klaus. I sat with that information for a long time. Long enough to ask myself whether this was coincidence. Long enough to decide that it absolutely categorically was not. So I did what any rational person would do. I said nothing. I smiled. I waited. Friday came dressed like it had somewhere important to be. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu. Not because they forgot, but because if you needed to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. Dark wood paneling, candlelight, a sommelier who moved through the room like he was walking on carpet no one else could see. Klaus was already seated when we arrived. He stood when he saw Rachel, and the way he stood, the slight lean forward, the warmth that flickered across his face before he composed it, told me everything I needed to know about what was happening between them. He was tall, silver-haired, with a kind of jaw that probably had its own LinkedIn profile. He extended his hand to me with a broad, generous smile. "Peter, I have heard so much about you." The German accent was light, barely there. He'd clearly worked to sand it down. "All good things, I hope," I said. "Of course." His eyes said, "You poor oblivious man." I shook his hand firmly and smiled back. My eyes said, "Absolutely nothing." We sat, we ordered. The conversation flowed the way conversations do when two people are performing for a third. Lots of laughter, lots of warmth, lots of careful avoidance of anything real. She touched Klaus's arm twice when she laughed. She touched my arm 0 times. I ate my sea bass. I asked Klaus polite questions about the markets. I refilled everyone's wine. And then right there between the entree and the dessert menu, Rachel placed her hand over her stomach. It was subtle, the kind of gesture a woman makes when she isn't even fully aware she's making it. But I had been watching her for months. I noticed everything. Klaus noticed it too. He glanced at her hand. She gave the smallest nod. Then Rachel looked at me with the full practiced warmth of someone who has been preparing this moment, and said in German to Klaus, "Don't worry, the idiot is so happy about the pregnancy. He thinks it's his. He'll raise your son without ever knowing." She laughed softly. Klaus exhaled. His shoulders dropped half an inch, and I sat there smiling, swirling my wine glass slowly, the way a man does when he has absolutely no idea what's being said around him. I let the silence breathe for exactly 4 seconds. Then I set down my glass, leaned forward slightly, and said in the clearest, most unhurried German I have ever spoken in my life, "Your father says, 'Hello, Klaus.'" The color drained from his face so fast it was almost medically interesting. Rachel's hand froze on the table. And somewhere across town in a private hospital room, an old man named Gerald Briner was waiting for a phone call from a son he just found, and an inheritance that was no longer going to go the way anyone had planned. I picked up my wine glass again. "Now," I said in English pleasantly, "shall we order dessert? A twist is coming, and trust me, the dinner was only the beginning. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs nothing. You nothing, and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely." There is a specific kind of silence that has weight to it. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a Sunday morning or a long drive with someone you love. I'm talking about the kind of silence that presses down on a room like a physical thing. The kind where you can actually hear people trying to decide what their face should be doing. That was the silence at our table for approximately 11 seconds after I spoke. I counted. Klaus Brenner, senior managing director, silver-haired $600 million man, was staring at me the way someone stares at a piece of furniture that has just stood up and introduced itself. His mouth was slightly open. A man like Klaus had probably not been genuinely surprised in 15 years. Watching him try to process what had just happened was honestly one of the more satisfying experiences of my adult life. Rachel was a different story. Rachel was looking at me, the way you look at someone when the floor has just dropped out from under everything you thought you knew. Her hand was still frozen on the table. Her face had gone through approximately 6 emotions in 4 seconds. Shock, confusion, fury, fear, calculation, and then something I can only describe as the specific panic of a woman who has just realized she massively, catastrophically miscalculated. I sipped my wine. "Peter, the Chateau Margaux is really exceptional tonight," I said pleasantly, setting down my glass. "Klaus, do you prefer a Bordeaux or more of a Burgundy?" You strike me as a burgundy man. Peter. Her voice was sharper now. What did you just say to him? I looked at her with the most genuinely confused expression I have ever assembled on a human face. I said, "Shall we order dessert? You didn't hear me. It's a little loud in here." And then Klaus cleared his throat. Now I want to pause here for a second, because I need you to understand something about Klaus Brenner. He was not a stupid man. Arrogant, yes. Entitled, absolutely. The kind of man who had moved through the world so long on the strength of his last name and his father's money that he'd mistaken inherited privilege for personal intelligence. But stupid? No. He was sharp. And in the 11 seconds since I'd spoken, I could see him doing exactly what a sharp man does when the ground shifts beneath him. He was calculating. He picked up his own wine glass, took a slow sip, set it down with precision, and when he looked at me again, something had changed behind his eyes. The warm, magnanimous host was gone. In his place was something cooler, harder. "You speak German," he said. Not a question, a statement. With a particular flatness of a man who is buying himself time. "Since I was about 19, I said. My mother thought it was a useful language. She was right, as it turns out. Rachel made a sound that was almost a laugh, the kind that comes out when a laugh is the only thing standing between you and a full emotional collapse. Peter, that was just not with anger. Just quietly the way you say someone's name when you want them to understand that whatever they are about to say should be chosen very, very carefully." She closed her mouth. I turned back to Klaus. "Your father's name is Gerald Brenner," I said conversationally. "The way you might say the weather's been strange lately. He's currently at Northwestern Memorial, room 412. He was diagnosed 14 months ago. Stage 4, which I imagine has made the question of inheritance feel rather urgent for a man in your position." Klaus had gone very still. "He began amending his estate documents 8 months ago," I continued. "His attorneys, Whitfield and Associates on Michigan Avenue, lovely firm, filed the initial paperwork in November. I imagine you were informed around that time. I imagine that is in fact around the same time you became very interested in my wife." The candle between us flickered. Rachel made a small strangled sound. Now I leaned back in my chair, completely relaxed. The way a man is relaxed when he has been carrying a thing for so long that finally putting it down feels like a vacation. "I don't know exactly what your plan was, whether you were gathering information through Rachel, whether you thought proximity to me would give you some leverage, whether you had something else in mind entirely. I've had some theories." I tilted my head slightly. "I've also had about 6 months to look into your finances, your legal filings, your corporate structure, and 3 offshore accounts that your own board of directors would find quite interesting." Klaus set down his wine glass. "I'm not here to threaten you," I said, and I meant it. "That's not what tonight is. Tonight is just an introduction, a proper one this time, without the performance." I gestured lightly between the 3 of us. "So, now that we all know what we know, shall we have an honest conversation?" What happened next is something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. Rachel started crying. Not the delicate cinematic kind of crying. The real kind. Sudden, ugly, genuinely uncontrollable. The kind that comes out of a person when the version of themselves they've been maintaining finally cracks straight down the middle. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, and her shoulders shook. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt the thing I had spent 6 months carefully not feeling. Because here is the truth about Rachel, and it is a truth I am not proud to admit. I had loved her genuinely. The kind of love that sneaks up on you while you're busy being sensible, while you're splitting a terrible pizza at midnight and laughing at something that wasn't even that funny, while you're sitting in the car in the driveway because the song on the radio is too good to get out for. That kind of love. The embarrassing kind. I had loved her, and somewhere along the way something had shifted between us. And instead of talking about it, instead of saying anything, she had made a choice, and that choice was sitting across from me at a table that cost more per plate than my first car payment. I looked at her for a long moment, then I looked away. "The baby," I said quietly, still not looking at her. "Is it actually his?" A pause. "Peter, Rachel, yes or no?" She wiped her face. Her voice when it came was so small it barely made it across the table. "I don't know." I nodded slowly. I had prepared myself for that answer. I had prepared myself for every answer. What I had not fully prepared myself for was the way it would feel to hear it in her voice. Quiet and ashamed, and genuinely lost, I picked up my water glass and drank from it. Okay, I said. Klaus had been silent through all of this, which told me a great deal about him. A man who cared about Rachel, genuinely beyond strategy, would have said something, would have leaned forward, or reached for her hand, or at the very least, looked uncomfortable, in a human way. Instead, Klaus Brenner had been sitting with the particular stillness of a man running numbers, assessing, adjusting his position. He confirmed everything I needed to know about him in his silence. "What do you want?" he said finally. His voice was even almost impressive. "That's a big question," I said. "You clearly didn't come here to make a scene," he said. "You could have done that months ago. You've been building to something." So he straightened slightly in his chair. "What is it?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I want to meet Gerald," I said. Something moved across Klaus's face, the first genuinely unguarded thing I'd seen from him all evening. It was gone in an instant, replaced immediately by the smooth, controlled expression of a man who has been trained since birth to reveal nothing. But I saw it, and what I saw was not anger. It was fear. "That's not possible," he said. "He's my father," I said simply. "He absolutely does," I said. "He hired investigators to find my mother 18 months ago. He found out she was gone. He found out about me. That's why the will is being amended, Klaus. Why do you think he's changing it?" I paused. The question isn't whether Gerald knows I exist. The question is whether he's going to get the chance to do something about it before his attorneys finish their work. Klaus said nothing, but his jaw was doing something very specific. The tight, controlled flex of a man holding something back by the grip of his back teeth. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," I said. "And this too," I meant. "I'm not interested in money. I'm not interested in the company. What I'm interested in is sitting in a room with a dying old man and hearing the truth about where I came from. That's it. That's the whole thing. So the question, Klaus, the only question that matters tonight, is whether you're going to help me do that quietly, like reasonable adults who are sharing a very expensive bottle of wine." I glanced at Rachel briefly, then back to him, "Or whether you'd like this to become complicated." The candle flickered again between us, outside through the tall restaurant windows. Chicago is doing what Chicago does in November. Wind picking up off the lake, sky pressing down dark and heavy, the city going about its loud and different business. Nobody moved, and then Klaus Brenner did something I genuinely did not expect. He laughed. Not a warm laugh, not a defeated one, a short, quiet, almost admiring exhale of a laugh, the kind that comes out of a person when they've just been beaten at something and they're too honest with themselves to pretend otherwise. "Your mother," he said slowly. "Carol Vance." I went still. My father talked about her. His voice had changed, something older at it now. Something that had nothing to do with boardrooms or balance sheets. Not often, but sometimes, when he'd had too much to drink. He looked at me for a long moment. He said she was the smartest woman he'd ever met. Said letting her go was the only thing in his life he genuinely regretted. The table was very quiet. He doesn't know what kind of man that made him. I said no. Klaus agreed. He doesn't. We looked at each other across that table. Two men with the same father, in a restaurant that belonged to a world only one of us had been born into. In the middle of a mess that neither of us had made, cleanly. Rachel had stopped crying. She was watching us both with the expression of someone witnessing something they don't have the language for yet. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and set a business card on the table in front of Klaus. "My cell," I said. "I'd like to see him before the end of the month." I folded my napkin neatly, pushed back my chair. "Dinner was excellent," I said, "the sea bass especially," and I walked out of that restaurant into the cold Chicago night, leaving two people at a table who each had a very different version of what was supposed to happen tonight. Neither of them had been right. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. There's something nobody tells you about revenge. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind, not the explosion, not the courtroom moment, not the slow walk away from something burning behind you. I mean the real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in spreadsheets and sealed envelopes and 6 months of saying nothing when everything in you wants to say something. Nobody tells you that when it's finally over. When every piece is exactly where you put it, the feeling isn't triumph, it's exhausting. And something else, something that doesn't have a clean name, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Klaus called on a Wednesday morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and my laptop, doing what I do every morning, following money. It's almost meditative. Honestly, most people think forensic financial work is dramatic. It isn't. It's mostly just patience. You pull a thread, you wait. You pull another one, you wait some more. Somewhere in the waiting, the picture assembles itself. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, German country code. I answered on the second ring. Peter. His voice was different from the restaurant. The performance was gone. What was left was just a man tired. I thought in the specific way powerful people get tired when they finally stopped performing. I spoke with my father's care team this morning. And Friday, Klaus said 2 o'clock Northwestern Memorial. I'll leave your name at the nurse's station. Another pause longer this time. He's not well, Peter. I want you to understand that before you go in there. I know. I said he has good days and bad days. Friday maybe. Klaus, I said his name the same way I'd said Rachel's at dinner. Quietly, precisely. I'm not going in there to hurt him. Silence. I know, he said finally. And I believed him. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. Not moving, not looking at anything in particular. Just sitting with the weight of a moment I had been building toward for 8 months, which was itself built on top of a lifetime of a question I'd never been allowed to ask. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, and went back to work. Because the money doesn't follow itself. I need to tell you about Rachel. Not the Rachel from the restaurant, not the woman with her hand on her stomach and the secret in her smile. The Rachel from before all of that, the one I actually married. We met at a work conference in Cincinnati. The kind of conference where everybody's pretending the free cocktail hour isn't the only reason they came. She was standing at the edge of the room in a red dress, holding a glass of white wine. And she was the only person in that entire networking event who looked genuinely amused by it. Not bored, not performing, actually amused, like she'd arrived at a party she hadn't expected to enjoy, and was pleasantly surprised. I walked over and said, "You look like you're watching a nature documentary." She looked at me and said, "I'm deciding which species is which." I laughed. A real one, the kind that catches you off guard. We talked for 3 hours. We missed every single panel we'd paid to attend. We split a cab back to the hotel, and she gave me her number and said, "Don't be weird about it." And I said, "Absolutely no promises." And she smiled. The smile that I would later learn meant she'd already made up her mind about something. We were married 19 months later. For 2 years, it was the realest thing in my life. I want you to know that. I want you to understand that what I'm telling you is not the story of a man who was always waiting for his wife to fail him. It is the story of a man who loved his wife, and then somewhere in year 3, somewhere between her promotion and his long hours and the silences that started filling the spaces where the conversations used to be lost her. Not all at once, gradually, the way you lose daylight in November. You don't notice the exact moment it gets dark. You just look up one day, and it is Friday, arrived like it had been counting down to itself. Northwestern Memorial is one of those hospitals that tries very hard to not feel like a hospital. Warm lighting, real art on the walls, staff who make eye contact and mean it. It doesn't entirely work because no amount of good lighting changes what a hospital fundamentally is, but they try. I appreciated the effort. I left my name at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, and a young woman in scrubs walked me down a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and something floral. Someone's flowers probably doing their earnest best against the reality of the place. She stopped at room 412. "He's been up since this morning," she said quietly. "Good day today," she said at the way medical staff say things like that. Matter of fact, kind, careful not to attach too much to it either way. "Thank you," I said. She left me at the door. I stood there for probably 15 seconds, which doesn't sound like long, but try standing at the door of the room where your father is dying sometime and see how long 15 seconds feels. Then I knocked once and went in. Gerald Brenner was smaller than I expected. I don't mean that dismissively. I mean that in my mind, in the version of this man I'd been constructing from investigator reports and financial documents and secondhand stories, he had taken on a kind of size. the size that absent fathers take on when you've spent a lifetime filling in the blank where they should be. In my imagination, Gerald Brenner was formidable, imposing. The man in the bed was 73 years old, thin in the way illness makes a person thin, with white hair and hands that lay on the blanket with the careful stillness of something fragile. He had an IV line in his left arm and a tablet on the tray beside him that was open to a chess game he'd apparently been playing against himself. But his eyes were sharp, clear, deeply, piercingly alert, in a way that made the rest of him feel like a temporary condition. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said in a voice rougher than I expected, but steadier, "You have your mother's jaw." I stood very still. "Sit down, son," he said, "please." It was the word son that did it. Not dramatically. I didn't fall apart. I didn't make a scene. I'm not built for scenes. But something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. A kind of slow, involuntary release, like a breath held for 31 years. Finally letting go, I sat down. We talked for 2 hours. I'm not going to give you every word of it, because some things belong only to the room they happened in. But I will tell you the shape of it. He told me about my mother, about the university, about the spring semester of 1991, about a woman who argued with his entire thesis on Keynesian economics in front of a lecture hall full of students and was so ferociously, effortlessly right that he'd been in love with her before she'd finished her second sentence. He told me about his fear, the coward's calculus of a young man for money who couldn't imagine what it would cost him to do the right thing. He told me about the investigator he'd hired, and the morning he found out Carol Vance had died, and what that morning had felt like. "I have been a man of considerable means my entire life," he said at one point, looking at his hands, "and I have made a remarkable number of poor decisions with it." "You don't have to do this," I said. "I know I don't." He looked up at me. "I want to. There's a difference at my age between the things you do because you must, and the things you do because you still can." A pause. "There aren't many of the second kind left." I nodded. Then he said, "What do you know about my son?" And something in his tone made me go carefully still. "What would you like me to know?" I said. He studied me for a moment. Then he reached over to the tray beside him, slowly deliberate, and picked up a sealed envelope. He held it for a moment without giving it to me. "Klaus is a talented man," he said. "He has run this company capably for 6 years. He is disciplined, strategic, and competent." A pause. "He is also being investigated by the SEC for fraudulent misrepresentation of fund performance to institutional investors. Has been for approximately 8 months, Gerald continued. His attorneys have been managing it quietly. He looked at me over the envelope. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I understood exactly what he was telling me. Klaus hadn't been pursuing Rachel because of the inheritance, or not, only because of it. He'd been building something else, a different kind of insurance. A forensic financial analyst with a spotless professional record, married to his key employee, closely connected to the Brenner family. That was a very particular kind of asset if things went sideways with regulators. The kind of asset you might want firmly in your orbit before the wall started closing in. I had not been the mark. I had been the plan B. "He doesn't know, you know," I said. "No," said Gerald. "And the will, the amendment stands," he said simply. "Regardless of what Klaus has done or hasn't done, you are my son. That doesn't have conditions." He set the envelope on the tray and pushed it gently toward me. "This is a letter to you written by me, witnessed by my attorneys, explaining the full truth of your parentage and my intentions. It is not about money. You may do with it whatever you choose." I looked at the envelope. "Why are you telling me about the SEC?" I asked. He settled back against his pillows. Something passed through his eyes. Tiredness, maybe. Grief of a particular variety. "Because you are the only person in my life right now," he said quietly, "who has absolutely nothing to gain from lying to me." I left the hospital at 4:15. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time, the sealed envelope on the passenger seat beside me, the city doing its oblivious Friday thing outside. Horns, wind, the distant sound of a train. I thought about my mother quizzing me on vocabulary words. I thought about Rachel in that red dress at the edge of her room in Cincinnati. I thought about Klaus's face at the restaurant, the flash of something unguarded, and understood now what it had actually been. Not just fear of losing an inheritance, fear of a man who could see the thing he needed to keep invisible. I picked up my phone. I had 3 messages. One from Klaus. How did it go? Sent 12 minutes after I'd arrived at the hospital. Nervous timing. One from Rachel. Peter, can we talk, please? And one from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out, when I looked it up, to be registered to a legal firm in Washington, D.C. that specialized in SEC whistleblower cases. I stared at that last one for a while. Then I started the car. Here's what I did, and I want you to listen carefully, because this is the part that matters. I called Rachel back first. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been holding the phone. Peter, are you safe? I said. A pause. What? Are you physically okay? Are you somewhere safe? Yes, I'm home. Peter, I need to the baby. I said, whatever happens between us, whatever this becomes, that baby didn't make any choices. She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said in a voice so stripped of everything practiced and performed that it barely sounded like her. I'm sorry, Peter. I am so sorry. I know, I said, and then because it was true. I know you are. We didn't fix anything that evening. You don't fix something like that in a phone call in a parking garage on a Friday afternoon. But I said what I needed to say, and she said what she needed to say. And when we hung up, there was something between us that had not been there at that restaurant table, something that felt strangely more honest than most of the previous year had been. Klaus I called on Saturday morning. I met him, I said. I know, he told me. A pause. How are you? I'm fine, I said. You honest answer, I'd prefer it. A long exhale. I've been better. And then after a moment, Peter, there are some things I need to tell you about the business, about the situation I'm in. I know about the SEC. Klaus, your father told me, I said, not to hurt you, because he needed someone in his corner who wasn't already compromised. More silence. Here's what's going to happen. I said, you're going to call Whitfield and Associates on Monday morning. You're going to authorize them to begin preparing a full voluntary disclosure to the SEC. Voluntary cooperation substantially changes the outcome. You know that, I know that. You do this quietly, cleanly, and you do it now, before they come to you. Peter, I'm not your enemy, Klaus, and I meant it, which still surprises me a little when I think about it. I'm not interested in watching you burn. I'm interested in this being over. All of it. A very long pause. Why? He said finally. Why would you help me? I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because you're the only brother I've got, I said. Gerald Brenner passed away on a Tuesday, which I've decided is simply what Tuesdays are for in my life. 6 weeks after our first meeting, we had seen each other 4 more times. We had played chess twice. He was considerably better at it than I was, and entirely unapologetic about it, which I respected enormously. In his final amended will, he left Klaus controlling operational interest in Brenner Vice Capital, subject to ongoing regulatory compliance, which Klaus, to his genuine credit, was already in the process of addressing. He left me something different, a letter, a name, and a modest but meaningful financial interest that Gerald described in his characteristically dry way as overdue with interest. More than that, he left me the truth, documented, witnessed, permanent, which is, as it turns out, the only inheritance that actually matters. Rachel and I did not stay married. I want to tell you that clearly, without drama, because this story is not about whether we stayed together. We tried for a while. We were honest with each other in ways we hadn't been in years, which was both better and harder than I expected. The baby, a boy, was born in April. DNA confirmed what a part of me had quietly suspected since that dinner. He was mine. His name is Daniel. He has Rachel's eyes and my mother's jaw, and absolutely no idea yet how complicated the story of his family is. He will someday. I'll tell him all of it, every part. I think my mother would have liked that. I still think about that Tuesday in the kitchen. Rachel leaning against the counter with her honey-dipped voice and her particular smile. Klaus wants to take us to dinner, and me looking up from my laptop, already knowing everything I knew, saying, "Sure, sounds great," and meaning none of it and all of it simultaneously. Some people ask me how I stayed so calm through all of it. Here's the honest answer. I wasn't calm because I was cold. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because my mother spent 31 years teaching me through every vocabulary quiz, every double shift, everything she chose not to say, that the most powerful thing a person can do in an impossible situation is simply refuse to be reduced by it. She carried a secret, her whole life, that could have made her bitter. It didn't. I carried it for 8 months. It didn't make me bitter either, which means she won even at the end, which means she always won. My name is Peter Vance. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, with a mother who worked too hard and loved too well, and never once in 31 years let me see her break. I found my father. I found my brother. I lost my marriage and found my son. And on a Tuesday, the most insulting day of the week, a woman I loved sat across from me and tried to hand my life away like leftover takeout. She didn't know I spoke German. She didn't know a lot of things. But the one thing she never knew, the one thing nobody in that room knew, was that the man sitting across the table smiling like a fool had already won. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.